Good morning. And welcome to our Bibliography Week lecture for 2021, Manuscript Cookbooks and Their Audience by Stephen Schmidt. I'm Arlene Shaner, the Historical Collections Librarian at the New York Academy of Medicine Library, and I am so pleased to welcome you to our 2021 Bibliography Week lecture. I'm just going to tell you just a little tiny bit about the New York Academy of Medicine for those of you who may not be familiar with who we are. So here at NIAM, we are champions for health equity, and we are working to eliminate the barriers that prevent everyone from living a healthy life by generating knowledge, changing systems, and engaging the public to ensure health for all. I'd also like to say a word for just a minute about our library, our wonderful historical library. We are one of the most significant history of medicine and public health collections in the country, if not the world. And we've been open to the public since 1878. Of course, right now, our doors are closed to in-person researchers, in-person tours and classes. So there are still many ways to engage with us in the library by checking our digital collections, our events, our newsletter, and our virtual visits. You can learn more by just going to our website, niam.org/library, and then following us on social media as well. I would like to just begin by thanking the Severall Incorporated Fund, which is one of the sponsors that supports this lecture. And I would also like to thank all of you who are attending, who were kind enough to make a donation in support of this program when you registered. We really appreciate your generosity in doing that. So let me just say a word about how the program is going to proceed. Once Steve starts speaking, we invite you to put your questions into the chat. And then at the end of his talk, I will be sharing them with Steve during the question and answer session. So he'll be able to answer any questions that you have about what he is speaking about. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Stephen Schmidt, our speaker for today. I first met Steve in 2012 when Sylvia Tannenbaum brought him to the Rare Book Room to start examining our collection of pre-1865 English language manuscript receipt books. This was before the Manuscript Cookbooks survey, for which Steve is the principal researcher and writer, ever existed. Sylvia knew she wanted to create it, but she was just at the beginning of all the work with many, many partners that led to its creation. Steve came to our Rare Book Room many times to explore our manuscripts, and we really became friends when he brought me a delicious packet of cracknels, which are lovely 17th century biscuits that he had made from a recipe in one of our manuscripts. I have continued to have the lucky opportunity more than once to eat wonderful dishes that have been cooked by him from other historical recipes in the years since then. Because Steve is, in addition to being a researcher and writer, also a fabulous chef. So today he will be speaking about manuscript cookbooks and their audience. And I know that some of the manuscripts that we are going to have a chance to hear about are from our collections. All of the manuscripts that Steve looked at in our library long ago are digitized now, and you can find them in our digital collection, Recipes and Remedies, Manuscript Cookbooks, and also on the Manuscript Cookbooks survey website. So please join me in welcoming Steve for our 2021 Bibliography Week lecture.
Arlene, thank you. The memory of the cracknels, that's a lovely memory. For those of you who do not know the Manuscript Cookbook survey, It features a descriptive database of English language manuscript cookbooks begun by 1865 that are in US public repositories. It also has a blog and several other features. The site, as Arlene said, was first proposed by Sylvia Tannenbaum, and she co-created it with me, and I want to thank her. And it is her foundation, Pine Needles, that supports the site and all of my work on it. Next slide. If you or I today were to compile a manuscript cookbook, we probably would just simply jot down recipes in a notebook, perhaps paste things in from newspapers or magazines, and we would end up with a kind of messy, jumbled, personal recipe notebook of sorts. And if you go into the archives, you're going to find a lot of manuscript cookbooks that look exactly like that. But you're also going to find a number of manuscript cookbooks that were clearly written for other people. And one of the big tip-offs for that is that they've been carefully copied, in some instances by professional scribes. And they tend to have print features such as elaborate titles, tables of contents, either by page number or alphabetical. They have pagination or foliation, recipe numbering. Sometimes they are organized, although that's somewhat uncommon, and we'll talk about that a little bit. Occasionally they have illustrations. Most of these books were written between 1600 and 1800. As you get into the 19th century, you get more of the sort of jumbled personal recipe journal types. There were probably reasons for that. The culinary change sped up in the 19th century, so there wasn't a lot of point in spending time in compiling an elaborate handwritten cookbook. And in addition, the prestige of handwritten cookbooks declined in the 19th century. The other thing is that print authors gained increasing authority during the 19th century because they were publishing in magazines and newspapers, they were giving lectures, and so on. So these books they're characteristic of they're early modern rather than later. Next slide. Here's a fascinating book. This is Cookbook of Anne Smith. This book, unlike most books, actually shows both the owner of the book and the person who wrote it. At the top, you see Anne Smith Sr., her book, October 10th, 1698. And on the bottom, you see this book was written by Thomas Barnaby of Reading. Go to the next slide. I don't think that Thomas Barnaby was actually a professional scribe. I think he was probably a friend. For one thing, the handwriting, it's handsome, but it's not wonderful. And the other thing you see is that he planned to write the book only on the rectos of the leaves, which is common. But go to the next slide. Here you see that he did cram some recipes onto the verso, and that's probably because when he went through the book the first time, he forgot some recipes and he had to stick them in where he hadn't planned to. You can see the recipes are numbered 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. He later forgot about that too. He dropped the recipe numbering. Also, I don't think that a professional scribe would have written his handiwork right on the inscription page. I don't know that, but I think these two were friends rather than him being an actual professional. Next slide. This manuscript, on the other hand, which is a very grand manuscript, in the collection of the New York Academy of Medicine, a very substantial book with 390 recipes. This was clearly professionally copied. Despite the fact that it was professionally copied, there's no inscription. Some of the recipes are marked JH. That's underneath that, underneath there. You can't see that, but I'll show it to you. And the book is totally unorganized, which you wouldn't think so for all the grand production that it is. Next slide. Here you can see the lack of organization. You have on the same page a recipe for raisin wine and another one for a canker in the mouth. And if you look at that recipe on the bottom, what you see is there's those initials JH, may or may not have something to do with the author. And there's an attribution to a Mrs. Golding. Next slide. This is one of the most interesting features about this book. There are 3 recipes for the same cake in this book. The first and second recipes appear on 167 and 175. And then the third recipe shows up on this page, 187. You look on the bottom there, I've underlined it in red. Big triumphant statement, this recipe is approved of. Now, it seems exceedingly strange that you would have a cookbook elaborately copied and you would leave all 3 of your recipes for a cake in, including the 2 that didn't work. And I don't know for sure why this happened, but I will say that there are certain turns of phrase in this book that sound a little bit like the author may have been a member of the Royal Academy. The Royal Academy at this time was filled with avid recipe collectors, and I mean Royal Society, not Royal Academy. And possibly this man was a member of the Royal Society, and he wanted all 3 of his recipes in there to show his scientific progress with this cake. It's a mere guess. I don't know. Next slide. Here you see the very beautiful index, and that to some extent compensates for the lack of organization. There's an error here. This is not a table by page number. This is an alphabetical table. I will show you a page table a little bit later. I have a manuscript with that. Next slide. This is Cookeries from the Folger. This is another beautifully copied manuscript, 376 recipes on 265 pages. Again, there's no identification on this, probably because it was done within a family and everybody knew who had written it and who it was for. But there is in this manuscript, unlike in choice receipts, there is some organization by subject. Next slide. Here you can see the organization. This is page 2 and 3 of this manuscript, and it shows a recipe for a white soup and a recipe for another soup. And soups in this manuscript continue to page 21. And after page 21, you have also some recipes that are clustered by subject and some that are not. So the plan wasn't consistently carried out. When early modern manuscripts are organized in any way, this is generally the way they're organized. They're organized by recipe cluster, and this is the way a well-known manuscript, the so-called Martha Washington Cookbook, is organized. And Karen Hess, the food historian who did a wonderful annotated edition of that book, theorized that the way this happened was that these were books that had been handed down over several generations in a family, and each time the family would recopy them, add new recipes, delete old recipes, and in the process organize them. So in other words, these organized cookbooks were continued cookbooks. I haven't seen a lot of evidence that there was a lot of copying and recopying and revising of individual manuscripts, but later in this talk, I will show you manuscripts that clearly were continued, but by less formal means than this. Let's go to the next slide. Here's a table from Cookeries, again, a very beautiful table, again, an alphabetical table. Next slide. This is a remarkable manuscript and a very rare one. It's from the Beinecke Library of Yale University. And what you have here in this manuscript is atypical in that there are 14 separate chapters, and the recipes are numbered in all of these chapters. You can see that I've put the numbering in yellow highlight, and if you look down to the right-hand corner of your screens, you will see what the chapters are: wet sweetmeats, dry sweetmeats, creams and cheeses, posset syllabubs, biscuits and jumbles, cakes, gingerbreads, and so on. You notice that, as is typical in these books, most of the recipes have something to do with parties or desserts. That is what most people were most interested in collecting. Although you do see at the end of this manuscript, there are also recipes for dressing fish, soups and made dishes, side dishes, and other non-dessert kinds of items. Next slide. Here, what I've done is I've shown you the second to last chapter in this same cookbook. And you see I've also put the recipe numbers in yellow highlight. We're up to 472, 73, 74, 75. This book is just remarkably sustained. The organization is sustained, the numbering is sustained, the handwriting is sustained. Who this was for is really not clear. It came down in a household where for various reasons it couldn't have been compiled there. It might have been bought by the household, or it might have descended in either the family of the husband or the wife. But in any case, it's really a remarkable production. At the end, there's also several pages of bills of fare in this manuscript. Next slide. All right. This is this manuscript at the University of Pennsylvania. This is a manuscript with a remarkable title. And the title is The Great and Rare Art of Candying, Distilling, Preserving, Pickling, and Physic, containing, I can't remember what that is, I can't see it, I think 336 receipts above, never before made public, now made public through the intercession of some friends for the use, good, and benefit of the country, with several others for making several sorts of wine. And you see that the author there, Mary Statham, has put her name. She's put the exact day and date of publication. This is not the only manuscript like this in the archives. There are other manuscripts like this with these kinds of titles that kind of make some pretense of being printed books, not just borrowing a few features, but actually mimicking printed books. One thinks maybe these people had a desire to be professional cookbook authors. Next slide. Here are two recipes from the third page of Mary Statham's book. The recipe idiom here is very professional in both of these recipes. If I'd had more time, I would have gone through some print book sources and seen if I could have found where these recipes came from, if in fact they were copied. If they were copied, Mary Statham was just furthering her project of imitating a print cookbook, because in 1724, most of the recipes that you would find in a printed cookbook were copied from other printed cookbooks. So I don't know if these were, but it's a fair bet that they might have been. Next slide. Here's Mary Statham's table. And this is an example of a table by page number. You can look at the bottom there and you see we have the 2 recipes on page 1, then on page 2, then we have the recipes on page 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This isn't as good a way of finding recipes in a cookbook that has no organization, but it's probably better than nothing. Next slide. This is a one-of-a-kind cookbook. This man that you see here in his adulthood, when he was 15, he wrote a satiric cookbook. He was a North Carolinian, the son of a diplomat, editor, banker, and an abolitionist mother. He and his brothers served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War. He later became a school teacher and school principal. Next slide. Here is the title page of his book, Recipes in the Culinary Art, together with hints on housewifery. This is at the University of North Carolina in the Blackford Family Papers. You look at, there's this poem on the bottom, jars of jelly, jars of jam, jars of potted beef and ham, and then skip to the last 2 lines. Would the only jars were these that occur in families. Next slide. Here is some imitation publication data. You see some bleed through there from the title page, which is why some authors preferred to write only on the rectos of the leaves. Next slide. Here's a preface, and the first paragraph reads, I'm going to have to guess some of it because I can't see all of it. The subject matter of the following compilation enters so deeply, so extensively, and so intimately in the comfort of man that no apology is deemed necessary for offering it to the public. He's absolutely nailed the kind of bloviating and usually moralistic prefaces that were typical in 19th century American cookbooks, printed cookbooks. And the preface goes on from there. It's amusing, as the whole book is. Next slide. Blackford was also a cartoonist. Here you have a cartoon. The caption is "One of the advocates of internal improvement." And you see this rather corpulent gentleman with his leg, which is obviously afflicted by gout, up on a stool. And yet he's got a very happy smile on his face as he drinks his wine and looks forward to tucking into that dish on the table, which looks like a big, fat, quite unhealthy boiled pudding or something of that kind. Next slide. And here's the table. And this again is an alphabetical table. This is a wonderful book. This is truly a one-of-a-kind book. Next slide. Now, you've probably guessed from what I've said so far that usually the audience for manuscript cookbooks were other people in the family of whoever wrote the book. However, there were also some extremely interesting books that were written to display in a library. They were written as semi-public documents. And we're going to start with 2 of those manuscript cookbooks. Next slide. Henry Frederick, Prince of Wales, was the firstborn child of King James I and his wife, Queen Anne. And following his investiture as Prince of Wales in 1610, he strove to create an image of himself as an educated, cultured Renaissance prince and worthy future king of England. let me go over to here. This project had many components. He was very athletic. He mastered hawking, jousting. He compiled a remarkable art collection. He had an extensive library. And this cookbook that we're about to discuss seems to have been part of this project, this 448-page cookbook. I wrote here that he commissioned it. When I thought about it, and investigated his library a little bit more, I have a feeling that he simply acquired it, that it was already written, but I'm just guessing about this. I don't know in what particular way it's linked to him. But the interesting thing about this book is the book is mostly given over to the conceits of the banquet, which was a lavish spread of sweets that was sometimes served as a final course of a grand meal and sometimes staged as a standalone party. And banqueting was the sort of thing that elite people in Henry Frederick's time did. And a knowledge of banqueting on this scale implied remarkable sophistication for a boy who is really a boy. As many of you know, Henry Frederick died when he was just 18, and the succession passed to his younger brother, Charles I, which didn't work out so well. Next slide, please. Here's the cover of the book with a crest that I haven't been able to identify, but I have a feeling that it links the book to Henry Frederick. And over here, you have the first page of the chapter on preserves, and you have a recipe for preserving quinces white and one for preserving quinces red. Quinces were great favorites at banquets, in part because you could preserve them in all kinds of colors. And they also had certain medical implications, and banqueting was supposed to be not only delicious, but it was also supposed to be good for you. Next slide. Here you have a list, an extraordinary list. It's titled Several Sort of Sweetmeat Fitting for a Banquet. And it goes on for pages, and it covers all kinds of sweetmeats that you just do not find in other printed and manuscript cookbooks of the time. Clearly, royal banquets were different. There's a little red arrow up there on the left on the photo of the page. And what it says there is one great marchpane with very high comfit made, but that's covered with a statue on the top of marchpane stuff, and three other marchpanes that have been set forth with pasteworks and comfit. Marchpane was marzipan. All banquets, that was the great thing at banquets, the most important dish. Print cookbook authors say there are supposed to be 3 on a banquet table. Here, I guess because this is a royal table, there are 4 of them. Let me show you, next slide. Let me show you what these were. These are, I don't know if you can see what's underneath there, but these are marchpanes that were done by the remarkable English culinary historian Ivan Day. And on the left-hand side, you see a reasonably simple one. Those golden squiggles, those are the comfits. We today call them dragées. And then on the right-hand side, that massive structure in the middle, that is the pastework that was referred to before in the previous slide. That's made out of sugar paste. And then the marchpane is underneath it there. That's the knot garden that is partly made out of marzipan and partly made out of fruit preserves. Why is this interesting? The reason this is interesting is that James I acquired an estate called Theobald's that was outside London. It was demolished during the interregnum. Theobald's had a remarkable pair of banqueting houses in the gardens. And the banquets that were held in those banquet houses are to some extent documented. But of course, what's documented are the activities, the people who attended the banquets, and so on. What's not documented is what might have been on the table. So here we have some idea of what might have been actually consumed in those banquet houses in Henry Frederick's book. Next slide, please. Robert Jocelyn was born in England, but he lived in Ireland most of his adult life. He was a lawyer. He was appointed Lord Chancellor of Ireland and took his seat as the Speaker of the Irish House of Lords. And he was created Viscount Jocelyn in 1755. He was married actually twice. He had a son. And I don't know where I got this information, but he was reputed to be an amiable, unassuming man with a literary and scholarly bent. And you will see that in his book. Next slide. What Robert Jocelyn did in his dinner book, which is at Winterthur Library, is he compiled 200 pages of diagrams for dinners. And the diagrams indicate not only what was on the table, but where it was placed, whether the dish belonged at the top, at the bottom, or to the side. And here we have diagrams of 3 simple family dinners where just he and his wife and son and maybe a friend or two would have been eating. And you see the one at the top there. The first course is a soup at the top, pork roast at the bottom, and then we have an apple pudding and mutton cutlets as the side dishes. And then the second course, you have duck, lobster, sausage, and pancakes. That progression follows the usual dinner progression of English dinners, elite English dinners, I should say, from the 13th century into the 19th century, where the first course is meat, to which soup was added beginning in the late 17th century. And the second course was more delicate fare, lots of fowl, and sometimes seafood and sausage and pancakes in this particular dinner. Next slide. Here you've got a much more formal dinner for 15 guests. And I wrote 2 courses of 13 dishes each. Actually, this is 2 courses of 15 dishes each. And the reason I got a little confused here is in the first course, both of the soups are removed by other dishes. In other words, people came into the room, all those dishes were on the table, including the soups. People ate the soups, and then the soups were whisked away, and other dishes were set in their place, usually fish, which is the case of the soup at the top, although not the one at the bottom, which is replaced by a saddle of mutton. And the removes were counted as dishes. So actually there were 15 dishes in each course. Ideally, meals had the same number of dishes in both the first and the second course, but that didn't always pertain. Next slide. This is an illustration of a ball supper. And all the dishes at a ball supper were cold, and guests ate them standing after they had been dancing and socializing and so on. And here again, you can see that there are circles with showing removes. Here we don't have soups because, of course, all of these dishes were cold. What you see, what I was going to mention is at the corner there, you see that there are 2 large pyramids of sweetmeats. You've probably seen illustrations of those. And the bottom of that L there, that seems to be where most of the sweet dishes are offered. The ball supper had a combination of savory and sweet. Next slide. Okay, now we're going into the books that were written for family and where it is clear that the books were written for family. Usually, as I said, this is not indicated that the book was written by a family member for other family members because everybody knew it already. But this book, which is at the Folger, the cookbook cookbook and medicinal recipes of the Granville family was handed down over a period of about a century. And although you can't really read it, the open book on the left-hand side has an inscription. And the inscription comes from Mary Granville, who was giving the book to her daughter, Anne Granville, at the time of her daughter's marriage to John Dews in 1740. The inscription is a little bit confusing. It reads, Mrs. Anne Granville's book, which I hope she will make a better use of than her mother. And that's, of course, the mother writing that. And Mrs. Anne Granville doesn't make sense to us because we think that should be Miss Anne Granville. But at this time, Mrs. was used as an address for both married and unmarried women. And following the inscription, Anne Dews wrote a note saying, now Anne Dews, and that she lived in Bradley with her husband, John Dews. Next slide. Here, again, this is a cookbook that has no inscription, no indication of who wrote it, and no indication of whom it was written for. But we can figure this out. Because the reason for its having been painstakingly copied is buried within a recipe in the book. This is a very unusual book. It is by a German immigrant woman who married into a German-American family of paper makers in Maryland. She had very minimal command of English, and most of the recipes are actually like those that we today associate with the so-called Pennsylvania Dutch. And in this recipe, which unfortunately I can't totally read, this is a recipe for ersatz coffee that is made from apple slices, and she extols this beverage as better coffee than any store coffee. No doubt it's wholesomer too, so try it. At the end of this recipe, and you can see I've underlined it here in red, she puts this little note. She writes, my dear little motherless grandchildren, it is well enough to know those things. We don't know what is before us in the world. We may become poor. And then there's a word that you can't read. So in other words, you know, presumably her grandchildren and her family is used to drinking real coffee, but who knows, you may need this ersatz coffee. And presumably what happened here is that the children's mother died, and her great-grandmother is now stepping in to give them the recipes that their mother couldn't. Next slide. Let me catch up on my script here. Here we come to the reason that manuscript cookbooks can make you want to throw yourself out a window, which is that so many of them are not actually just one author. They're a single author that have been continued in other hands or that have other hands. And sometimes the hands are just random, or they appear to us to be random. We can't figure out why the hands are there. But many times the hands, it turns out, actually have been added in order to continue the cookbook. And usually what's going on here, we can infer, is that the cookbook was handed down to later descendants in the same family, and then they added their own recipes to the book. Next slide. This is an example. This is Cookbook of Susanna Pack. It's at the Folger. This is an example of a cookbook that has non-continuous or random hands. Susanna Pack's hand is there on the right. She's writing a recipe for boiling sturgeon. Her book is organized, although in an extremely strange and inconsistent way. But the long and the short of it is that she's writing in this section of the book about principal dishes, fish, and so on the left-hand side of this book, you see that somebody has come along and written recipes for lemon cream and orange cream, which are desserts. And so this person has completely flouted whatever organizational plan Susanna Pack had in mind. Next slide. Okay, can we push that up? I can't read the bottom of this slide, which I need to do here. Okay, I'm going to have to just tell you what the bottom of this says. These are two slides. Can I do that on mine? I don't know what you can see on here. We have this is a very interesting cookbook. On the one hand, you have 36 pages that were clearly copied professionally, and you see an example of one of the copied pages, page 11. You see that on the left hand of your screen. And then the copied pages are succeeded by pages 37 to 94, which are clear and easy to read, but this is an amateur hand. So you look at this book and you say, well, what happened to this book? Is this just two different books that happen to be written in the same notebook? If you look at it closely, what you discover is that, in fact, these the two sections of this book have overlapping attributions. And you can see on the left-hand side that baker has been written in by that recipe for lemon cream. What you cannot see, unfortunately, is that the bottom of this recipe for boiled rice pudding, Mrs. Baker is written in. And what you also cannot see in this slide is that the hand that added baker to the professionally copied part of the manuscript is the same hand that wrote the recipe for boiled rice puddings, the same amateur hand. Let's see, go to the next slide. Maybe we can see this more clearly. Yes, oh, good. Yes, here we can see it. This is Pridham, and there are multiple recipes from Pridham, who turns out to be Mrs. Pridham, in both sections of this manuscript. And here we see they've been written in the professionally copied section of the manuscript. And here we see Mrs. Pridham in the amateur section. The hand is clearly the same hand. It's the same person's hand who wrote those attributions. Now, what's going on here? Possibly, or I think even logically, this is two different people who both of whom had access to the same cache of recipes. And perhaps the first person was an earlier member of the family and the amateur writer was a later member. However, it's also possible that the two sections of this book were compiled by the same person. And the first time around, through pages 34, this person had the recipes copied and then later decided to continue the book in his or her own hand. I don't know, but what is clear is that these two pieces are related. They look like they're not related, but they clearly are related. Next slide. This is a cookbook that is largely in one very fine hand, and it is clearly the hand, I think, of a professional copier. And what I've showed here is the second to last and the final page of the section of this manuscript that was original. And you see you have recipes to make spirit of cinnamon and one for the biting of a mad dog. And then you've got Feeney at the end of that recipe. Next slide. Here you've got recipes that are in two added hands. There are about 20 pages of these recipes. There's a principal adder, and then there are a couple of minor adders on this manuscript. And you have a recipe for raisin wine on the left, and you've got one for almond cake on the right. Next slide. And here, what I've done is I've shown you the table, and I'm delighted to see that you can see the whole thing in a red underline. On the left, you see that to make almond cake has been added to the table. That was an added recipe. And then you also see that biting of the mad dog, which was in the original manuscript, is there. And then on the right-hand side, you see the added recipe for raisin wine, and you can see the original recipe for spirit of cinnamon. There are lots and lots of manuscripts that look like this. And in some manuscripts that are organized, an effort has also been made to insert added recipes in the space where they belong in the manuscript, although that's not always possible because there's not always a place for them. Remembering what I said about organization, and when recipes are organized by recipe cluster, the copying over and revising of recipes, as I say, is not something I've seen. I think that when manuscripts were continued, they were usually continued like this, that people added recipes in the back, and then they put the recipes in the table, and if they could, they inserted them in the appropriate spaces in the manuscript. Let's go to the next slide. This is the final section of the talk. This is about collaborative cookbooks. Collaborative cookbooks were sometimes compiled within a family, sometimes compiled within a circle of friends, sometimes compiled by both. The tip-offs for collaborative cookbooks, first of all, okay, I say I'm over, are two or more hands that recur. And the other tip-off is that sometimes the recipes are clustered by subject. Let's go to the next slide here. This is an example of recipes a book that both the recipes are recurring and they're clustered. And here we have breakfast cakes, we have rice, flapjacks, donuts, Indian cake, more donuts, graham cake, etc. And go to the next slide, please. Here you're going to see an extraordinary number of recipes for blancmange. Next slide. Here we've got blancmange and attributed blancmange. We have currants preserved, which is something that you ate with blancmange. We have a cheap blancmange. We have a cheap blancmange another way. Next slide. And then we have another blancmange. We have ice cream, which was almost as popular as blancmange in the 19th century. And we have arrowroot blancmange. Next slide. This is perhaps a one-of-a-kind cookbook. I don't know. Two individuals wrote recipes on alternating pages. One wrote recipes for sweetmeats and other desserts. One wrote recipes for principal dishes, that's meat and fish and so on. Next slide. Here I've put up a close-up of the sweetmeats page with gooseberry paste and to dry gooseberries, which was really a form of candied gooseberries. Next page. Next slide. And here I've given you a slide with principal dishes with calf's head, broiled pigeons, dish of rabbits, chicken pie, sausages. Next slide. This is our concluding manuscript. This is a fascinating story behind this manuscript. The book is titled on our site, Scott's Cookbook, Partly in the Hand of Lady Grizzel Bailey. I had no idea that this book had anything to do with Lady Grizzel Bailey until Elizabeth Chaghoffy of the University of Tübingen, who had transcribed part of this book, told me that it did. And what happened is that, unfortunately, you cannot see the bottom of the slide on the left-hand side, but Leslie Abernathy, which is the part you cannot read, published a wonderful biography of Lady Grizzel Bailey this year. And she saw online my description of the Lady Grizzle cookbook. And go to the next slide, please. Lady Grizzle is known in Scotland for a number of different reasons. She's a legendary figure, but one of them is that she and her husband, George, began construction on Mellerstane, where Leslie Abernathy has long been a house guide. Next slide. But she is known to culinary historians because Lady Grizzle compiled 1,000 pages of household accounts. And these household accounts were, an extract of them in 1911 was published as Lady Grizzle's Household Book. And the household book, the accounts and the household book include a number of dishes, a number of bills of fare for meals that were served in Lady Grizzle's house, made by her cooks, and also bills of fare for meals that Lady Grizzle ate outside the house. Now, what Leslie Abernathy very kindly went through this entire manuscript, and she identified several of the people who collaborated on it, including Lady Grizzle herself. And what you see here on the left is Lady Grizzle's soup, recipe for good green soup. And then what you see on the right is green soup in one of Lady Grizzle's bills of fare. So we actually know a little bit about how to produce this bill of fare, because here we have Lady Grizzle's own recipe for it. Next slide. Again, here's Lady Grizzle's recipe for fricassee of anything. Here is a bill of fare with fricassee chickens. Fricassee was such a big deal at this time. And she has many fricassees. Next slide. And here we have her recipe for lemon pudding. And then we have a bill of fare for lemon pudding. All right, that will do it. I'm ready for questions.
Thank you so much, Steve. There are lots of questions in the chat. I got to go up to the top here. We'll see how many of them we can get through. Back up to the top. So, yes. So Mark asks, why are there cookbooks in a medicine library?
I bet you could answer that better than I can.
Well, I can answer that very quickly. So there are cookbooks in a medicine library just because a lot of these cookbooks, as you might have seen when Steve was speaking, contain both culinary and medicinal recipes. And so they are a combination of things, and they also address the issue of what does it mean to be healthy. And there are some that have, dietary guidelines. He also has a question about what is choice receipts?
You mean, what does the word receipts mean?
Yes, I think.
Receipts was the original form of the word recipe, and it was the usual form of recipe really into the late 19th century in both England and America.
Marini would like to know if any of the recipe books have dietary guidelines or information about meal times and what was eaten at meals.
Oh, yes. Yes, many of the recipes indicate whether they're first or second course dishes, whether they're dinner dishes, whether they're supper dishes. Yeah, there's tons of that information, but it's certainly there. Yeah.
Mark again wants to know, what are wet sweetmeats?
Sweetmeats were classified as wet and dry, and the easiest way to think of it is a dry sweetmeat was something that was literally dry, like we would think of candied ginger or maybe Jordan almonds, whereas a wet sweetmeat, I don't know how familiar people are with things like stemmed ginger in syrup, but it was some kind of fruit or preserve that was in a very heavy syrup, and so it was literally wet.
Betty Schellenberg would like to know if you find that these books tend to be created from blank paper books into which the recipes were copied, or are they collations of leaves bound subsequently?
I would say usually the former. And that goes to an extremely interesting, complicated question about these books, because one of the reasons I believe that so many of these books are not organized is that they were copied from another book that was not organized. And I think if people collected recipes on separate leaves, as a rule, more of these books would be organized, because it wouldn't be so difficult to shuffle these leaves around and put them in piles according to subject. But that's a very interesting question. Much investigation is warranted there.
Caroline Schimmel says that last week some of us were discussing sugar. Once it was discovered, what do one use it for? And an English history friend thought it was to make a crust on a roast beef, setting the bar really low for future recipes.
I have not ever seen sugar as a crust on. Putting a crust on a roast beef was a thing that interested people a great deal. But I have not seen sugar used that way.
David Brody said, do we find manuscript cookbooks intended for professional chefs working for royalty or government? For example, a cookbook intended to serve as a guide for state dinners.
There are a handful of books that I have seen that were compiled by bakers and a couple by cooks. The thing is that most of these books were not compiled by cooks. They were compiled by the cooks' employers. And the relationship between the cookbook, the writer of the book, and the actual cooks is another thing that issue that of great interest and needs investigation. Yep.
Laura would like to know if you found that some receipts look to be copied from magazines or other periodicals, as well as from printed cookbooks, even in the earlier ones, say the 18th century.
Oh yes, there's a fair amount of copying. Yeah, there was a fair amount in the very beginning of these books during the Renaissance to 1625. The printed cookbooks were actually pillaged from these manuscript cookbooks because there were no cookbook authors at that time. But as soon as you get into the 17th century, mid-17th century Restoration, a lot of these books have printed recipes in them because printed cookbooks had become something that a lot of people owned.
And Elizabeth Shagafi wants to know, how can you tell that a manuscript cookbook was written for display rather than use?
Hi, Elizabeth. I don't think you can. You can't tell that for certain, but I think that there are certain tip-offs. There are certain tip-offs, first of all, in who actually wrote it, or to whom it belonged. I mean, possible that Henry Frederick's steward took that book down from the shelf and read the recipes to Henry Frederick's cooks, but it looks more like a library copy to me, and certainly Jocelyn's book is a library copy. There aren't very many of these books, but they're of interest.
Elizabeth also wants to know if those elaborate pastework structures like the one that you showed were actually eaten, or did they stay on the table?
You know, people at this time had an enormous appetite for just plain sugar. And one of the recipes that really sticks in my mind is from a print cookbook. I think it's by Dawson. People made tableware, the cups, the glasses, the platters, out of sugar paste. And Dawson says this is a wonderful thing to do. They're so pretty. And then after the banquet is over, you break them up and eat them, and the paste is so savorous. Now, I don't know if that was just mere advertising, but it certainly sounded like they thought it wasn't just a sort of fun thing to do. You actually broke the sugar paste up and you ate it.
Madge Place wants to know, who were these professional copiers in the print period? Did private citizens contract with scribes who made their living creating manuscripts like these?
Good question. Now, you know, before the advent of print books, there were whole societies, professional groups of copiers. That's how books were made. And I don't know the specifics of this, but these people continued into the 17th, 18th century. And the decline of these professionally copied books, which you see a steep decline in the 19th century. There are very few of them. The two are connected: the disappearance of the copiers and the waning of the prestige of copied books. I don't know anything very specific about that beyond that.
Schwartz says cookbooks are often stained. Can you determine the substance that's splashed on the recipe?
In fact, people are beginning to do that. And there have been several blog posts that I've read. I can't point you to the sources immediately, but yes, people are beginning to do this. Now, let me add that they are less stained than you would think, and that's probably because most of them never went into the kitchen. To the extent that they were actually cooked from, what happened is they were read to the cooks by the steward or possibly by the compiler of the book. But yes, some of them do have food stains, and yes, people are beginning to analyze them.
Susan Buckley wants to know why there are fewer American than English manuscript cookbooks.
Hi, Susan. Well, that's not exactly true, but there are far fewer of these very beautiful cookbooks written for other people. And that's partly because these books tend to originate in families, and not only grand families, they tend to originate in families of the peerage, a lot of them, where there is a very self-conscious sense of proceeding from one generation to the next. So there are American ones. I wish I could have shown them to you. New York Public Library has several of them in the Whitney collection, but unfortunately none of them are digitized, and that's why I couldn't show them to you.
And Caroline again, who says, in the database, is there a way to track the popularity of particular ingredients? Perhaps matching expanding colonization of indigenous lands, use of their native plants as food and medicine.
No, not in our database. Maybe that is possible somewhere. I don't know.
Mione asks, can you elaborate on that? Approved of? Thank you.
You mean, I'm not quite sure what you mean by elaborate. I mean, the sense of that clearly is that this cake finally was approved of by presumably the compiler of the book, or perhaps the whole family. I didn't have time to go into the recipe. I actually have a slide of a cake like that. This is one of those great big huge party cakes. It's made with 7 pounds of flour, 7 pounds of currants, 32 eggs, I forget how many pounds of butter, so it really did matter whether this was a good cake or a bad cake, because it was for a very important function, and it took a lot of time and effort to put it together. Another interesting thing I will add is that the two failed recipes, the reason that they failed, I'm sure it would be a fruitful matter of study, because the reason the recipes failed, very minor differences, like instead of 32 eggs, it calls for 29 eggs. Instead of 7 pounds of currants, that's 6 pounds of currants and 1 pound of raisins. And you're thinking to yourself, did this really make such a big difference in this cake? And exploring these differences and coming up with some kind of conclusion for why indeed it did make a difference would quite likely give you some insight into cake taste at the turn of the 18th century.
Laura wants to know when and how was olive oil used medicinally in the colonies of America for salves and balms?
In the colonies of America, I don't know. I don't know anything about the medicinal use of olive oil, or really much of anything. I will say that olive oil shows up in English recipe manuscripts from the very beginning, even before the early modern tradition of the 16th century. It's there in medieval recipe manuscripts. There was always, and for one thing, a great deal of trade between England and Italy. But that was the typical oil that was used in salads.
Lori wants to know, do you have a personal collection of manuscripts? How many, and what are the oldest and newest?
Yeah, I don't.
Okay. Liz says, other than judgments of approved or not good, what other hints are there that a recipe was made and not just copied?
Yeah, well, there are a number of recipes in these books that are marked in some way that the rest is marked not good, it's marked great, it's marked probatum est, meaning that I really made it really did work. What you're asking is what everybody asks about this book. To what extent were these collections merely collections, and to what extent were they actually cooked from and used? And if you think about your own recipe collections, we all collect far more recipes than we ever end up by actually using. So I assume that's true of these books too, but it's you know, there isn't a great deal of evidence in these books about use.
So I'm going to ask just one last question because we are actually quite a bit over time now.
Yep.
Unfortunately, we're not going to get to all the questions that are in the chat, but we can save the chat and pass them along to you. So Sarah Koval wants to know, what's the scope of the recipe website? What percentage of extant recipe books is included in the database? And do you know what the range of socioeconomic status of owners and users of the recipe books that survive is?
Okay. We currently have 800 and something cookbooks in the database. And in answer to your question of what percentage of those books is how close is that to the total of all the books in US repositories? I don't know. We don't know yet. We have most of the major collections in there, but there are many historical sites, historical houses, and so on that have these books. And we're actually just starting the process of that really close digging. Now, socioeconomic. What you need to remember about cooking is that until well into the 19th century, almost everybody who cooked according to fashions, that was the expression that both English and American people used. Almost everybody who cooked that way was privileged. Everybody else, they had a very small repertoire of recipes, and the repertoire had nothing to do with the changes in culinary fashions. They had to do with local conditions. They had to do with whatever recipes had been handed down in your family or taught to you or whatever. That begins to change in the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, partly because technology advances made it possible for a wider swath of people to cook according to fashions, and then cooking magazines and various newspaper recipes, all of these things blossom to feed that need of a wider cooking audience. But certainly when you're dealing with the 17th and 18th century, you're talking about a relatively privileged household. And those were the compilers of these books.
So thank you very much. Let's all join in thanking Steve virtually for this wonderful talk. I just want to mention as we stop that for a lot of these questions, you can find more information by going to the Manuscript Cookbook survey and reading blog posts and other information that are there. You can go to our recipes and remedies. Steve has a long essay that is attached to our copy that speaks directly to some of these questions. We're delighted that you all came for our Bibliography Week 2021 lecture and look forward to being able to welcome you in person at some time in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you too.